Hello, I'm Arthur Zakowitz, and welcome to Street Talk. This is where we feature industry leaders and experts who share their knowledge and insights about retail, fashion apparel, luxury goods, sustainability, and technology. Today, we welcome Shikha Jain, who's the author of a new study called the New American Dream Study, which we'll talk about in a second. But you're also a lead partner for Consumer and Retail North America and head of the Boston office at Simon-Kucher. Is that correct?
Uh, all of it except for head of the Boston office. I gave that up last year. So Arthur, I don't know if you wanted
Well,
to
you
redo that.
need to set priorities, and
Exactly.
that's totally fine.
Yeah.
So, before we talk about the study, could you just describe your career path? Like, how did you end up there?
Yes. So my career path, and I'll try to be brief about it. My whole family is in the world of finance. So I thought that was the chosen path for me. So after undergrad, I worked in finance, investment banking in New York City during the peak right before the financial crisis. So had a couple of good years. And then when the financial crisis hit, obviously had to look for something different, right? And it wasn't just me. I would come into the office and there would be floors that were just empty because people had been made redundant overnight. So business school is really where I started to explore this idea of consulting. And for me, the consumer side of it was always fascinating, right? I'm a consumer, you're a consumer, everyone in the world is a consumer. And also there's a behavioral economics, the psychology aspect of it, the fact that I can use my senses, touch, taste, feel, all of that, see, smell. That was what got me very excited about being in consumer. And consulting was one of those. The problem solving aspect is something that I find fascinating. And putting those two together is kind of how I ended up at Simon-Kucher. I've been with the firm for 14 years now, and just continuing to find ways to evangelize people on commercial strategy, on using pricing as a profit lever, on thinking through for retail businesses, how do they go to market with their assortment? With consumer businesses, how should they think about segmentation? With a lot of my clients right now, how is AI going to disrupt in either good ways or bad ways, different ways, their businesses, and so all of that is, I think the world is always changing. And so why I just love what I do and hope to continue to do it for a long time.
Amazing. So tell us about this study, the New American Dream Study.
Yeah.
What was the impetus behind kind of drafting this thing?
So late last year, we were just thinking about what should we do in 2026 that is fresh and new, trend based. And why do I say that? Because every year we try to pick a topic and we want to understand that consumer behavior, get a pulse on what real Americans are thinking about when it is certain topics. So last year with all of the tariffs announcements and the back and forth on that, we wanted to get a sense from the consumer on how do they understand tariffs? How do they think that's going to impact inflation or the cost of goods? How is that going to impact their lifestyle and daily living? So that was what we did last year and in 25. And then late last year, as we were planning for 26, we were trying to think, and we were just shaping around this idea of the American consumer has gone through so much in the last 5, 6 years. We had COVID, and then we had stimulus checks, and we suddenly had high inflation. We had supply chain shocks. We had, debt as a way to finance lifestyle. We have had geopolitical challenges, fuel crises in recent times, tariffs. There's always something that's going on in the consumer's world. But the last 5 years just felt like a lot had changed. And part of it was, when you look at different data sources, it's hard to find something that pulls everything that's impacting the consumer in one report or one set of data points into statistics, right? So you can probably get some really good insights on housing separately, or labor and the workforce, or things like the role of AI and so on. But there was nothing that was tying it all together. And so suddenly we wanted to do this new American dream, this idea of how has that American dream changed generation to generation, and how do young Americans today think about their future? And somehow we realized along the way that actually America's turning 250 in 2026. So what a perfect moment in time for us to tie those two things together and try to ask, like, what does the American dream mean now? Is it dead? Is it alive? Is it different? Right. And so, how do different generations think about financial stability, owning a home, side hustles, retirement? How do they view debt? How do they think about savings? And just generally, what does the American dream mean to them and can they achieve it? So that was really what we wanted to accomplish. And so the survey, we basically got feedback from a representative sample of Americans by age, region in the US, gender, a little bit on household income, but that was the goal. We wanted it to be representative. So 5,000 respondents are the basis of our study here.
So, as far as like my knowledge of the original, the old, let's call it the old American dream, that man I think was born out of and gained speed after World War II, right? So you would come,
Yeah.
these veterans come back. They, there was an explosion of suburban houses. Everybody had their own home. You didn't live with your immigrant parents, right? Everybody had a car. I was reading Robert Moses, The Power Broker, again, and reminded about how explosive, like, the parkway system had and cars and commuting. And this, I think that's my perspective. Is that kind of on the money?
Yeah, it's exactly right. When I think of the American dream, I think of a suburban house, picket fence, or white picket fence, two kids, a dog, something like that, right? Backyard, front yard, multiple rooms. That's kind of the image that comes to my mind. And you kind of describe something similar. I bet you people will have variations of what the American dream means to them, but, that is kind of how I always viewed the traditional American dream.
So what was some of the key findings from your?
Yes, there's so many key findings. Let's start with the American dream aspect, though. And we asked them, so what is a traditional American dream? Right. And everyone recognized it as something that's very multi-layered. It's still something that anchors Americans, but this idea of owning a home, raising a family, achieving success through hard work, stable employment, financial stability, retiring comfortably, safety and security, right? Those are all of the things that really matter. And then there were, some other aspects that people say are important, like access to quality education, personal freedom and independence, higher education, equal opportunity, symbols of success through material possessions, just this idea of being better off than one's parents. So being better off than the generation that came before you, sorry. Strong community, social connection, social status, entrepreneurship or training, government support. Like those are kind of this idea that everything is the American dream. It's not just a few things. There's a few things that are definitely core that I mentioned around home ownership, retirement savings, success through hard work and all that. But there's a long tail of a lot of other things that people just care about. And they formed the American dream, the traditional American dream. Here's what I find fascinating. Go ahead, Arthur. You were going to ask me.
Yeah,
Maybe
no,
I'll
I
stop
was just thinking
rambling.
about that.
Yeah.
In the report, you spent a lot of time looking at different generational cohorts, and there's
Yes.
differences between that. So, what does that mean? Is it because each generation they have their own set of values? Like, I'm trying to wrap my mind around that.
This is a fascinating part that when you ask people the traditional American dream, it's what I described. But when you ask them, okay, what does the American dream mean to you? Right. And I think this is where it gets a lot more curated. It gets a lot more specific. And, Americans are honing in on what it means to them. So it's not everything, right? Or it's not everything, but it's a lot more things like financial stability, retiring comfortably, personal independence and freedom are the ones that have risen to the top more than a lot of these other aspects of the American dream. But I think what's true, different generations are going to have place different importance on different aspects. But obviously, baby boomers that are in that age range of retirement want to be able to have stability to meet their needs and retire comfortably. Younger Americans like millennials and Gen Z actually they care a lot more about things like stable and long-term employment, safety and security, personal independence and freedom. So there is a little bit of that cultural shift that tends to happen generation to generation, but the core foundations, those top 5 priorities that I've been mentioning, continue to be important no matter who you speak to.
And what about, were you surprised by any of the results? Was there anything stand out like, "Whoa, um, that's interesting."
Yeah, there were 3 results that really stood out to me. Number 1 is that the American dream is still very much alive, right? No matter what generation you are, you associate it with it, either strongly or somewhat, and it does guide their life decisions. So that was number one, that we tend to assume or think that younger generations maybe are a bit more jaded or, have so many headwinds and so they're really struggling. But wow, that was like a big one, right? That there's still hope, that there's still this positivity the in our cultural DNA. The second thing tied to this is that everyone gave themselves the best chance at achieving the American dream. What do I mean by that? We also asked, like, everyone, which generation do you think has the strongest chance of achieving the American dream? And everyone gave them their generation the best shot at it. Right. So baby boomers said baby boomers. Gen X said Gen X. Millennials said millennials. Gen Z said Gen Z. And that to me was a fascinating part of this, which is that we just, again, like, it's in our DNA to think that we can, achieve if we just do the right things, work hard, work smart, pull ourselves up from our bootstraps and, shoestring our way. So there is a lot of that hope, if you will, that I found very fascinating. And I just love to see that there was that optimism still. And then the third and final thing was that, kind of tied into this idea of personal freedom and independence, that there is no single pathway to achieving the American dream, right? It's not like, okay, a 4-year college degree or a master's degree or getting a vocational job or a career in technology or, climbing the corporate ladder or entrepreneurship or government or public service, right? Not a single one of those stood out as being the reason to how you can achieve the American dream. Everyone just kind of says there isn't a clear path. And I think that is also fascinating.
What are the, I guess, the mechanisms or the marketing of the American dream? It seems that, when you look at like Madison Avenue, is that where it starts, this idea, this vision of what the American dream is and how you could achieve it? Like, how does that happen, do you think?
Think it That is a great question. I think a lot of it is through people believing that if they put in the time, do the work hard, they'll be able to achieve it. But also part of it is that priorities are shifting, right? So even though these ideas of home ownership or retirement for retirement and having a nest egg for the future are still important, I don't think a lot of people feel like they can achieve that because of high cost of living, which I think younger Americans have the biggest challenge with, right? They either have insufficient income or savings, they feel like there's job insecurity, they're uncertain about the future, they have limited opportunities. So there is still that desire, right, when you walk around, that yes, I want to achieve, and you hear about it in the media about people, just going from nothing and achieving things, and you see it around you in your community. But there are still a lot of barriers and headwinds to being able to achieve that. So how do people then still feel like they're achieving the American dream? And that is through a couple of ways. One, they're prioritizing today in trading off the future. So it's the buy now or live now, worry later, a lot of that FOMO, YOLO mentality, where that's really what is driving them. So a lot of young people will just continue to either take on debt or live beyond their means because it gives them a way to finance the lifestyle or the hopes and goals that they have for today. So that is one thing that I do worry about a little bit, is how could the future generations end up if we don't have a lot or they don't have a lot in retirement savings.
What are the challenges in achieving the American dream today versus 20 or 30 years ago?
Yes, that is one of those things where high cost of living is the number one, right? It doesn't matter where you are, but that is true universally in this country. And that is something that older generations basically do say, that it's much harder today to achieve the American dream than it used to be because of these factors, right? And that is number one. The other one is insufficient income or savings, job insecurity, uncertainty about the future. That is where you start to see some of the barriers. And there's some, I will say, pockets of Americans that will be, disadvantaged or struggle more than their peers. So, for example, if you are someone who is, you know, living in a remote town or a small town, if you are a first generation immigrant to the country, if you have less education, those are definitely folks that do feel the headwinds a lot more than others that maybe are in more urban areas, have a long-term history and heritage in the US, have advanced degrees and so on.
We just have a few minutes left, and I just want to change subjects and pick your brain a little bit about what you're seeing. What are you seeing in retail and consumer goods? What like kind of trends are notable? Which would be do we need to pay attention about?
So one is inflation, right? I know we are fatigued about talking about inflation fatigue, but it's true. A lot of times, especially when you start to see your daily living and the cost of daily living continue to go up, that's tough. So the fact that prices have been going up so fast uh, always means that there is going to be a change in consumer behavior. So 90% of Americans have said that they're going to do something different because of high inflation. And these are things like waiting for a sale or discount, looking for cheaper alternatives. And you see this a lot with dupe culture and the rise of less expensive, similar products where you're going to still get that sort of dopamine hit from retail therapy, but it's not going to break the bank. People are really looking at promotions to do some stock up behavior. And so for retailers, it's going to be critical to make sure they've got a solid promotional playbook. I think what tends to happen is when we feel like volume is at risk, retailers will go out and run a whole lot of promotions. But promotions are only effective if they're marketed properly, if the message is out there, and if it's something that is both top line and bottom line accretive or incremental. So running the same playbook on promotions from past years isn't the right thing. You really have to think about what objective you're trying to drive and what is the best event to do that. Yep,
Yeah, no, yeah, you said something really interesting, and it made me think about private label. Like if I'm a retailer or apparel retailer,
yep.
I should be leaning into that and kind of driving that, right?
And many are. Many are leaning into private brands or store brands or private label as a way to show less expensive alternatives or cheaper alternatives to something that is more of a branded or national good. Those assortments are getting bigger. A lot of consumers are not seeing the differences as much or are thinking about, hey, this is my wallet. There's going to be some things that I just have to have. And for me, that's Nutella, right? I don't care. It has to be Nutella. It has to be that brand by Ferrero Rocher. But there could be other products and items that when I go to the grocery, I'm indifferent to, right? So thinking about where you will still protect those brands or that those are important for a lot of consumers and where can you really increase your assortment and shelf space to drive some of those private label products, which for many retailers are also better for margins.
What is the final question? What's driving physical retail? Like, it seems like consumers are going back to physical retail, especially in Gen Z, I think. And why? Why is that? Why is physical retail important?
Physical retail is always going to be important for many categories, right? A lot of times, certain physical retail acts as a showroom if I need to touch or feel or try the product before I buy. And so there's many retailers that are really leaning into that. I think the next thing is that a lot of retailers are getting better about creating store experiences that that are exciting and fresh and make people want to come into the store. So it's no longer about in and out, or I just need this item. And so e-commerce is the best way to do that because of the convenience factor. But if retailers, and many of them that are succeeding today, are leaning into the way that their planograms are set up, the experiences in the store, how people can really get comfortable to actually buy more than they originally planned for through impulse purchases and attaching of different products. So yeah, that is always going to be important, right? Is that physical aspect, no matter how good augmented reality gets, I think you're still going to want to be able to, you know, have the senses tell you if this is the right product for you or not.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much. We're going to have you come back maybe before the holidays and talk about this year's holiday shopping season. I think that would be a good one. But again, thank you so much. And thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for having me, Arthur. Really had a great time.
Well, that's a wrap on this episode of Street Talk. If today's conversation was useful, the best thing you could do is share it with a colleague. It generally helps us grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a review. It takes 30 seconds and makes a real difference. For the full episode write-up, show notes, and our weekly newsletter, visit streettalk.studio. We're also on LinkedIn and Instagram at Street Talk Studio. We'll be back next week, and thanks for listening.